So did anyone notice the mid-Mass wardrobe change? Anybody? You did? I had been talking with Father Norm in the sacristy before Mass, and we were talking about Lent and Lenten liturgy, and while we were talking, without thinking, I automatically went and picked out a purple stole and put it on, and didn't notice it until I was actually standing there. So I went back and changed anyway. So I've done that before, actually. I'm not sure I've done that here, but come out with the wrong stuff on. Anyways, I was going to ask the group last night, or challenge them actually, and even give $5. I'm not going to do that this morning, but if anyone could tell me when was the last time we heard these readings proclaimed on a Sunday liturgy. Does anybody know? You know what it was? It was February of 2010. It's been a long time since we heard these three particular readings, and that is it's due to nuances in the setting of the liturgical calendar. And in some years, because of that, when Easter is and so on, the sixth week in ordinary time, which this is sometimes skipped. The Beatitudes, of course, we are very familiar with, but mostly we hear the version in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, from the famous section of his gospel we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew's version of the Beatitudes has 8 Beatitudes and no woes. And the Gospel of Matthew, we believe, was written and used primarily by Jewish Christians. And it speaks about the new attitudes, the new mindset that would be necessary for them to live in the kingdom of the Lord. So we read that the heart must be pure, and the spirit must be poor. And those who mourn the plight of Israel, fallen from God's, will be comforted. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will receive the kingdom of heaven. He told them there must be a transformation from the Old Testament mentality to a new life, a new testament, a new kingdom. The Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew present some of the fundamental challenges that ancient Jews needed to undertake to become Christians. And in Matthew, Jesus gives the Beatitudes from a mountain, just as Moses gave the law of God from Mount Sinai. Well, there are only 4 Beatitudes in Luke, and they are followed by 4 woes. Luke's gospel actually is rather different from Matthew's. Luke was a Gentile himself. He was a Gentile convert, and his gospel seems to have been directed primarily to Gentiles. So Luke's audience was poor. Many were slaves or low-born, and their choice of Christianity, their choice to follow Jesus Christ, only exacerbated, made worse their situation. These were people who were persecuted and suffering. And in presenting the Lord's word to them, interestingly, Luke places Jesus on a plain. He was on a level ground with them. Jesus, too, was poor and suffering and persecuted. And in the verses leading up to where our gospel begins today, Jesus had called his disciples to himself, and he chooses his apostles after spending the whole night in the hills in prayer. And he comes down with them to a level place. And we read that this place is crowded with hordes of people from all parts of the region and beyond, even to the coastal cities. And presumably among this group were believers and unbelievers, and those considered to be outcasts or outsiders, perhaps not welcome in proper society. And the verses skipped, there were two verses that were skipped in the lectionary. The verses skipped in today's gospel describe those gathered as diseased and troubled by evil spirits. And one of the skipped verses reports, everyone in the crowd sought to touch him because his power came forth from him and healed them all. This power, his spirit and presence was experienced as healing and comforting and soothing and calming and promising. And then we pick up in the gospel with the most amazing line. And it passed by rather quickly, and perhaps it didn't even register. But this was the line. And raising his eyes toward his disciples, he said, wow. Think about that. Put yourself in that scene. He raises his eyes. We're led to believe, we're led to understand that Jesus is probably kneeling on the ground, tending to those in pain and suffering, attentive to the needs of those reaching out for him. And it is from this position that he speaks the Beatitudes. And Jesus knew that sometimes the best way to promote understanding was to illustrate rather than to tell. He seemed to like very much to engage people's imagination. So for a moment this morning, I'd like for us to try to use our imaginations and create what the scene described in today's gospel might look like in our day. So this is Julie's story. My name is Julie. I'm a single mom. My husband, Nate, died 5 months ago after a 9-month battle with pancreatic cancer. I have 2 kids, a boy, Max, who's 7, and a girl, Natalie, who's 11. I used to make pretty good money working at a large financial firm in Cleveland. But without Nate's income and with the medical bills piling up, things started to get tight. But we trimmed our expenses as much as we could. We got rid of cable and that kind of thing, and we did okay. But my company downsized 2 months ago, and I lost my job. I keep sending out resumes, but I don't get responses. Or I do, but I get turned down after one interview. I've applied for jobs that are much less skilled and pay less than I used to get. But I'm told over and over again that I'm overqualified and they won't hire me. Even with food stamps and unemployment, we're barely scraping by. I've fallen behind on our mortgage payments. I didn't tell Nate, but even when he first got sick, we started to fall behind. We needed his income every month for those payments. I don't know what we're going to do. My spirit is absolutely crushed. I just don't know what we're going to do. I don't know what made me join the crowd here at Virginia Kendall, just a few miles outside of Akron. I heard rumors that there was a teacher in the area, and people were saying how wise and compassionate he is. I hoped maybe I could see him, and maybe he'd have some words of wisdom about what I can do to save my family from becoming utterly destitute and homeless. Or maybe something to get this sick feeling out of the pit of my stomach. So here I am, sitting on a warm rock, surrounded by scrubby grass, people on all sides of me. And he's settling in, and he's getting ready to talk. Blessed are you who are poor, he says, for the kingdom of God is yours. And he looks right at me, just right at me, only for a second. But his eyes meet mine, and suddenly I know that even though my spirit is feeling completely destroyed, somehow I am blessed. Not blessed like lucky, not blessed like happy, but blessed, watched over, accompanied, and suddenly I know that God's presence will give me the strength to go on. Just one more day, and one more day after that. God is here with me, and I can do it. Thanks be to God. You know, we often think of the Beatitudes as rules or conditions for being blessed or receiving our heavenly reward. And Luke this morning gives us pause to think a bit differently. They're not about building up, accomplishing, or acquiring anything. They're about letting go, surrendering, living with a vulnerable and open heart. That doesn't mean that we run away from or back down or isolate ourselves from our life in the world, but it does mean that we engage them in a different way, Jesus' way. The Beatitudes teach us to trust God more than those external circumstances of our lives. They invite us to depend on God rather than totally on ourselves. And the prophet Jeremiah, in his own way, reminds us through vivid imagery that it may well be in the trauma and setbacks of life, those difficult circumstances we often find ourselves in, that we discover that we really cannot do life by ourselves. Sometimes it's just those difficult circumstances that help make us aware of our need for God in a most profound way. Not just the need for God to provide us with everyday needs, but our need for God to provide our very existence and to sustain us through all of that. When we become aware of God, our whole approach to God changes. We begin to be converted to the way of Jesus. So I invite you for just a moment to imagine yourself on that grassy field at Virginia Kendall and hear for yourself that Jesus is not telling you what you need to do to be perfect. He recognizes in your gifts the true beginnings of the reign of God, the possibility. And these gifts are meant to be given away, including your most precious possession, your very self. Give yourself away lavishly, and then you will truly know to which we are called.